already been elicited through this line of questioning, and this is far outside of the scope of 702.
Yeah, I'm going to sustain the objection because we're talking now about issues he has with Dr. Smith's findings, and that is not his qualification in general. That is specific to his issue and opinion with Dr. Smith. So for voir dire purposes, I'm going to sustain it. You can get to it on cross-examination, but for voir dire, I think we want to focus on the qualifications and the methodology that he applies.
Yes, Your Honor.
Motion to strike that question.
Stricken.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Longfellow, in regards to the way you tested these findings, you never actually conducted any tests yourself, correct?
No, I did not.
You never conducted any methodology in person yourself, correct?
I conducted theoretical methodology.
Theoretical knowledge on working towers, correct?
Yes, based on my experience as an investigator and based on my personal utilization of this technology.
Did you mimic any of the methodology used by Dr. Smith in his findings?
Excuse me?
Did you reenact any of the methodology that Dr. Smith used, or did you simply analyze and read his report?
Are you asking me if I physically visited locations?
I'm asking you if you mimicked the methodology used by Dr. Smith.
I did not visit the locations that Dr. Smith visited, if that's what you're asking.
So that's a no to my question. You did not use any methodology Dr. Smith used.
No.
And your methodology, as you stated in court, was basically reading, gathering the data, and stating your conclusions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Objection, Your Honor. Needlessly cumulative. I think at this point the witness's methodology has been established. If opposing counsel wants to question its validity or its reliability, then that's what the voir dire.
Well, he was summarizing, and that's permissible, so you're overruled, but your point's well taken.
And I am, at this point, done with the voir dire, Your Honor. I will save my time for cross.
Okay, are you renewing your objection?
I am renewing my objection. My objection still stands that this witness is not an expert witness, has not proven methodology that can be confirmed. And going back to case law, actually under Richards v. Mississippi, Midland Rules of Evidence does not allow an expert unlimited license to present a chart or data, in this case, in a manner that simply summarizes the testimony of others, which is what I believe Mr. Longfellow is doing, and will continue to do if allowed to testify as an expert witness.
Your Honor, may I respond on those grounds?
Well, let's leave that for if he uses a chart, because I haven't seen a chart yet. So, but let's focus on the qualifications. I'll give you the last word on the voir dire issue, the qualifications. Essentially, is he qualified to testify to the opinion which you expect to elicit?
Yes, Your Honor. Under 702A, the necessary, if I may have a moment of the court's leisure to pull up the rule, the specific rule, so I don't make a misstatement. 702A about the expert's requisite knowledge. This witness has testified extensively to his experience with cellular tracking firsthand, his experience as a consultant conducting audits of other investigations. Dr. Smith's investigation was part of a criminal investigation. It was an analysis of telecommunications data, which this witness has direct experience with and experience with as an auditor. 702B, sufficient facts or data. This witness is simply auditing Dr. Smith's report, and he's doing that based on the report and all the materials that Dr. Smith had available to her. Assessability is the product of reliable principles and methods. This witness testified to the comparative method of auditing, comparing the practices that Dr. Smith used with best practices in the field, telecommunications, and crime scene and criminal investigations. And finally, the expert has reliably applied the principles and methods to the facts of this case. If I'm allowed to continue with my direct examination, the witness will explain exactly how he applied that comparative method to today's case.
It was a very good exploration of the witness's qualifications. He is qualified. There are questions of weight, right? The question of associate's degree versus PhD is for the jury to decide who they want to believe. So that's a weight question, not an admissibility question. So I find him qualified. You can continue to elicit the opinion. The voir dire was noted and was very well done on both sides.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Longfellow, I believe we were discussing the cellular tracking portion of Dr. Smith's report. So can you tell the members of the jury how exactly Dr. Smith used cellular tracking?
Well, Dr. Smith went through call logs that indicated which cell towers Dylan Hendricks pinged or sent data to on multiple occasions throughout the night, and he used that data to determine or attempt to determine the location of Dylan Hendricks.
And how does that compare to best practices in the field?
Well, cellular tracking is relatively new, and it is becoming more common, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always reliable. it's, for example, there's one problem in particular here. Cell phones don't always ping or connect to the closest tower. There are other factors that are involved which may cause a cell phone to connect to a tower that is actually further away.
And could Dr. Smith use the overlap of area covered by multiple cell towers to try and narrow down where Dylan Hendricks might have been?
Yes, absolutely. However, there are problems with that as well. If you see, the range of these cell tower signals are not constant. They're shifting constantly. And also, moreover, they're not perfectly circular. So it's actually very difficult to establish what that area of overlap would be, and it's impossible to establish what the area of overlap was after the fact.
Well, what do you mean you can't establish the area of overlap after the fact?
So if a fugitive were to make a phone call and the police were investigating and trying to find this person, they would be able to, at that second, find that person based on that call. But this is not what happened in the case of Dr. Smith. With Dr. Smith, he's retroactively using data that indicates that Dylan Hendricks had made calls on a previous day when the conditions would have been different.
Right, now I'd like to move on and talk about the second part of Dr. Smith's analysis that you brought up, the Wi-Fi data. What Wi-Fi data did Dr. Smith use?
Dr. Smith gained access to information which substantiated that Dylan Hendricks had logged into the Belleone Wi-Fi between 10:49 p.m. and 10:52 p.m.
And how did Dr. Smith use that Wi-Fi data to try and narrow down Dylan Hendricks' location?
Well, Dr. Smith conducted her own investigation into it. She went over to the Belleone residence, where she brought a cell phone, and just walked around the building and connected to the Wi-Fi a number of times. And she took from that that this somehow indicates that Dylan Hendricks must have been within 10 feet of the Belleone residence on the night of the attack.
So how does what Dr. Smith did in this instance compare to best practices in the field?
Objection, Your Honor. Once again, under 702, this time specifically referring to the Wi-Fi. We have heard that the witness is qualified. The court has agreed that the witness is qualified to a certain extent in geolocation, but never in the witness report or in the witness's own testimony has he ever stated or has it ever come out that he has been trained in any means whatsoever in how Wi-Fi signals work.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
I have it on a good faith belief, well, if I may make an offer of proof.
Sure.
If the witness is allowed to continue testifying, I have it on a good faith belief that he'll testify as to whether the experimental methods, the investigative techniques, were reliable. Not as to whether the scientific background for the Wi-Fi range is correct or incorrect. He's not going to talk about any of the scientific data, only whether the investigative practices, specifically conducting this test using the phone, is a reliable method of investigation based on his experience as a police officer.
If I may, Your Honor,
Okay.
briefly.
Yep.
He made comments on the experiment, but the experiment is still related to Wi-Fi, something through which he is not qualified to talk about. So any Wi-Fi based experiments, he still has no prior knowledge, no prior foundation, no prior technical experience laid down or shown throughout this throughout this direct that proves that he can testify reliably to these principles, and he has no reliable data or methodology.
Ripe fodder for cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Mr. Longfellow, how does Dr. Smith's experiment compare to best practices in investigative techniques?
Well, a single trial, a single experiment, is never very conclusive in terms of testing things of this severity.
So, based on this single experiment, can one conclude that Dylan Hendricks must have been within 10 feet of the Jaywood building at the time of the attack?
No, he could have been further. There simply isn't enough data to say.
So, what exactly are your conclusions with regard to today's case?
I believe that Dr. Smith's report might be less conclusive than I think it should be granted.
Nothing further.
Thank you. Cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Longfellow, you were paid $18,000 today, correct? For all the work you have done.
That's correct.
Those $18,000 were 60 hours spent on analyzing a report?
Yes, that's correct. Analyzing the report.
And you said that you're pretty expensive, correct? hired to analyze this based on face value. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I'm able to analyze the report insofar as I see the investigative process take place.
Face value, theoretical knowledge, but you criticized that Dr. Smith only conducted one experiment with your Wi-Fi, correct?
That's correct.
You conducted exactly 0 experiments, is that correct?
That is correct. That's not what I was retained to do.
So you have 0 anything of any of your own personal data, is that correct?
No, I don't have any personal data myself. You're correct. But for example, with the Wi-Fi range, Dr. Smith certainly doesn't have any conclusive data either, and that should be taken into account.
You rely a lot on your training. You stated that it certifies you in telecommunications and geolocation, FBI. That was 6 years ago, correct?
Yes, I spent my time using cellular tracking, and a lot of them led to convictions,
That's
actually.
a yes to my question.
That's correct.
You criticized Dr. Smith by saying that it had been a few weeks since the time between buying a new phone, the investigation Dr. Smith conducted, and the event happened, and that therefore the cellular algorithm could have changed, correct?
Yes, that's correct. That's
And-
one of the issues.
And that change in cellular algorithms could have had the pinging be different, correct?
Yes, that's
Could have
correct.
had the location be different, correct?
That is correct.
So why does your 6 years without update on telecommunication cellular pinging, why does that carry more weight than a 3-week difference?
Well, I was trained in the use of cellular tracking, and when in my training, I was informed on how these things work.
Mr. Longfellow, technology moves at a rapid pace, doesn't it?
It depends on what kind of technology you're talking about.
You would agree that in general, technology moves at a rapid pace, doesn't it?
Again, I stick by my answer that it depends on what sector you're talking about.
Enough to give you concern about a few weeks difference, isn't that correct?
Well, in that case, you're talking about the shifting of the cell tower signals. You're talking about the development of technology.
Is that a yes to my question?
Your question being?
That you were concerned with a few weeks difference because technology changes quickly enough to change an algorithm.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I see what you're saying. Yes, in terms of how the cell signals shift. Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Longfellow, you also stated that Dr. Smith went to commendable lengths, isn't that correct?
Absolutely.
You respect Dr. Smith's work a lot, isn't that correct?
Absolutely.
And you never state that Dr. Smith is wrong.
I don't state that Dr. Smith is wrong in any of his factual statements about the domain. All I say is that I think he puts far too much weight, and he doesn't take into account some of the complications.
Far too much
Of
weight on
cellular
these.
tracking.
Your Honor, I'd ask that opposing counsel may witness finish his answer.
Yeah, make sure the witness can finish his answer before you interrupt him and ask another one. Go ahead
Yes,
and
Your
finish, Doctor.
I just simply believe that Dr. Smith might be overconfident in the results of his experiment.
And you criticize each individual part of his test, correct?
That is correct.
But you later stated at the end of your report that the sum of all these parts can be greater than any individual flaw. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and I also state that circumstantial evidence, when it may look compelling, can often lead to a misleading conclusion.
And in your individual experience as a detective using geolocation tracking, you have used these circumstantial evidence to put people in prison. Is that correct?
That's correct in different situations, in different contexts.
So you trust geolocation when you were a detective to put people in prison, and you relied on circumstantial evidence. Isn't that correct?
Well, it's circumstantial evidence. Those were different cases. There was more direct evidence in those cases corroborating the accounts of the telecommunication.
And to reiterate for the court, you never conducted any experiment yourself?
Excuse me?
To
In
reiterate
this
for the-
case?
This question has been asked or answered, whether or not he conducted his own experiment. It's been established at this point that he audited Dr. Smith's conclusions. He didn't conduct independent experiments.
Your point's well taken. It's a different part, and it is cross-examination. I'm going to allow the answer because it doesn't seem egregious yet. You can answer.
I didn't conduct an experiment.
You didn't conduct any experiment of your own volition
In
with
this
cellular
case.
tracking or Wi-Fi, correct?
In this case.
In this case.
That's correct, yes.
And you were trained in geolocation, you were trained in telecommunications, you were trained in tracking 6 years ago. You were never trained in Wi-Fi, correct?
No, I was not.
And the one part of the report that you specifically take issue with is the way that Dr. Smith conducted his Wi-Fi test, correct?